Hello, everyone. Got three short lessons today. The first one is diseases and challenges with tomatoes. Um, a lot of the elements from this lesson are common across all diseases and viruses, but can't hurt to review some of this stuff. Um, Seeds, oftentimes we forget to go back to the original source, and seeds can be a vector for all kinds of problems. So, your seed supplier is an important relationship, and records regarding seeds are just as important. So keep that in mind. Sometimes it's just out of your control. Um, so infected plant material, so grafting, for example, tomatoes, a lot of them are grafted onto rootstock. Typically, this is done by a contract farm. So it's important to make sure that grafting is done in a clean fashion. So you can go to a farm and inspect their processes, make sure that they're meeting your expectations. Otherwise, you have to learn how to do it yourself. Um, Insects, a huge vector. I think we all know that. Birds are another one. They can be a problem, carrying all sorts of diseases. A lot of farms now put screens on their vents, and that does keep the bird problem at bay. It also keeps food safety in check. Then, of course, there's staff and visitors. Visitors, we all know about that, but staff are another one, right? So let's say, for example, your staff go home and go to their personal little cannabis tent where they grow their best weed and it's covered in thrips. Uh, there's always a potential that your staff will be vectors for disease into your farm. So a lot of farms have uniforms with laundry services and stuff like that to try to contain disease. Um, so sanitation is critical. Choosing resistant varieties. So obviously, doing your homework on what you grow is a big deal. A lot of farms will fly over to other countries where the trials are done, like in Holland and Germany, um, to see for themselves how varieties are performing and make decisions based on disease pressures that they experience. Um, I've said this before, communicating with staff is really important. So if you have a bunch of people that are working in your crops, thinning, trimming, harvesting, whatever, uh, those are more eyes and ears that you can use to help you solve problems. And so the better that you listen to them and that they can feed back to you information, the quicker you'll be able to contain outbreaks in your farm. Uh, Not enough can be said about proper fertilization. If you don't have your nutrition program in check, your plants are somewhat weakened, which makes them so much more susceptible to all kinds of diseases, whether it's bacterial, fungal, or even viral. A healthy plant can often contain infection to a limited area and not let it spread. Not always, but often. And the same thing kind of applies to climate. So if your plants are growing in the ideal climate, then they're not stressed and they're more able to fend off disease. Or, for example, you have a climate that's not suitable for disease like fungal and bacterial to reproduce. So it's critical that your climate is managed properly. Water management, which ties into climate, essentially root stress. This is more to do with root borne infections, primarily fungal, some bacterial. Managing your root zone properly, not excessively drying to the point of causing damage, or not overwatering to the point of reducing oxygen content and having death, which leads to necrosis and of course opens up entry points for disease. Same thing applies for pH and EC. Obviously, keeping the roots happy. Um, Pruning. Uh, if you don't prune out growth, you don't get enough airflow through your crop. You don't get enough light to leaves to dry the surfaces. Working in the crops and keeping on top of that is absolutely critical. It's tempting to save money to put things off, but that quickly will cost you more in the long run. So putting the money into proper labor is by far a more economical stopgap for disease incidents. Then, of course, isolating infected areas. It's funny, a lot of this is kind of a parallel to what we're going through in the world right now, but in a farm, it really is no different. This is daily life. Quarantining sections where you have an outbreak. That means limiting staff movement and tools and stuff like that. Then, of course, there's chemical controls or biological controls, really, as well. Let's go through some of these diseases. Um, bacterial canker, which is called Clavibacter michiganensis. I'm guessing you know which state that originated in. It is definitely a serious bacterial problem. It shows up on the fruit. Uh, it shows up on the leaves. Uh, it moves quickly. It spreads effectively. So it's something that you have to rogue out immediately. Um, Typically, wilting is on upper leaves, and you may see it on one side only. So if you're thinking it's a potassium deficiency, remember that should realistically be presented on both sides of a leaf. If you have necrosis on one side, then bacterial canker is something you need to suspect. And again, if you see it in one plant on a whole row, it's more likely a disease. If you see it on the entire plant at the same time, then it's possibly nutritional. So use your logic to sort of determine if it's a virus or bacterial infection or if it's a nutritional or climate problem. Late symptoms of bacterial canker, obviously it looks pretty nasty. You get lots of necrosis starting at the top and moving its way down. If you shake a plant, the fruit will often fall because the attachment points weaken. You may also see mottled in the green, yellow sort of mottling of the developing tomatoes. Pretty nasty problem in the tomato greenhouse. So roguing out plants, isolating, preventing personnel from going into the area or restricting who can and who can't. Using clean clothing, and then changing your clothing after working that area. So sometimes disposable Tyvek suits, perhaps even minimizing work for a period of time until your sprays have had an effect, if that's your optional route. Separate equipment and tools, right? So your scissor lifts, your hand tools, all uniquely used only in that part of the greenhouse. Yes, gloves, that kind of stuff. This bacteria is endemic. That means it's pretty much everywhere in North American soil. So it is very prevalent in North America. And it's not like the phrase is not a matter of if, but when. So prevention is key, right? So standard hygiene, good quality practices for preventing the spread of anything is your best bet. A common treatment for these is agrophage or viroid. I know you've learned this, but I'm going to go through it anyways because I got the slides and it's pretty cool and kind of relevant, I think. So let's look at them. So agrophage obviously is a virus that infects bacteria and essentially injects DNA into them. And on the right there is a scanning electron, actually a transmission electron microscope image of viruses being ejected from a bacterial as it bursts. And so one virus infects the bacteria, produces, millions of little more viruses, and the pressure of the viruses causes the bacteria cell to burst. Basically, like think of spores and a fungus, and out they go, and you have a rapid spread of further infection. So bacteriophage is a powerful method for controlling bacterial infection in crops. So a lot of times agrophage is sprayed on crops preventatively a couple of times through their cycle. These viruses do not affect humans. They do not infect the tomato plants, so they are pretty safe and easy to use and very effective. Sometimes it just doesn't make any sense to continue with the tomatoes if you get Clavibacter, so you rip them out and you plant cucumbers, which are not infected by Clavibacter. This will break the cycle in your greenhouse, finish off another crop, get some money, maybe not as much as the tomatoes, but it's better than nothing, and then restart your tomato cycle again at another time. The cutoff time is August, so it's still worthwhile to transplant new tomatoes before August if you're going to break the cycle and start again. But after August, it doesn't make any sense because you're running into the dark days towards the end of your crop and your inputs just won't make sense economically. But before August, you can definitely pull a lot of tomatoes off your crop. So Clavibacter is present in soil for sure, but it is also known to be seed-borne. So again, going back to your seed supplier, that's critical. Fusarium, we've talked about this before. Looking at the vascular bundle in the center, you can see the discoloration of Fusarium versus this is a healthy one. This is a bad one. Obviously, if you have fungus clogging up your vasculature, you won't get water to the top of the plant, so you see wilting. It will also begin typically at the roots and move up. So you'll see discoloration around the soil line, the air-soil interface, and roots will look weakened, but generally that's the entry point. Yellowing of older leaves, so it goes in at the bottom and begins to affect the older leaves as it moves up to the plant, and you'll see willowing, wilting, and yellowing. There are definitely cultivars that are resistant, so selecting the correct ones is definitely do your homework if you want to reduce your Fusarium incidence. Obviously, sterilizing your recirculating water is a critical part of success as well, but varieties, the more you can build into genetic resistance, the better off you are. Another interesting thing about Fusarium, if you take a knife and you cut down the stem sideways, you can see the brown stained vasculature. That's a quick way to diagnose it. You can even do that to a vine as it's in situ on the plant, on the bag, and see what's going on. Remember in class we talked a little bit about how, because it's vasculature, you can have it so that only the steel on one side of a petiole is affected. So in this leaf you can see all the tissues on this side have been affected by the Fusarium, where this side have not been affected. Obviously that won't persist like that, but eventually, initially you may see sort of uneven distribution, and that's another helpful sign that you have a vascular-borne infection. Moving on to botrytis. This is something where it's through wounds. Think about it. Where do we get wounds in high-wire vegetables? It's from staff working in the crop, pruning leaves, harvesting fruit, that kind of thing. So we have to be careful that they have clean utensils, but we also need to, because there's all so much work happening, we need to make sure we don't have an environment that's favorable for botrytis to reproduce in the first place. So we don't want high relative humidity or low vapor pressure deficit, if you want to be more accurate in terms of transpiration, but I prefer to focus on humidity for botrytis. So poor greenhouse environment management is where you get botrytis from. It typically can be found in all plant parts, but often starts at the tips of growing tips. That could be an apical meristem or a leaf tip, and then it moves backwards from there. So here's some tomato leaves showing you the botrytis as it's progressing along the leaf. Again, pretty classic botrytis stuff there. Mold. Another fungal problem with tomatoes is, it's an interesting name, Fulvia fulva. I don't know who makes up these names. But anyways, it starts on the upper surface of old leaves, right? And sometimes it's purplish underneath. The fungus starts at the bottom and then continues to grow through, or we call translaminar, to the underside. And you start to see purple, which is a clue that the plant is stressed, so anthocyanin production in response to the fungus. It is often confused with magnesium deficiency. Again, you're looking at this leaf, there's big green sections here, and other places not, where magnesium would present in the entire leaf, right? It would be everywhere. So again, use your logic to help ascertain if it's a nutrient deficiency or a disease. Again, also, just to repeat, if it's a single plant in a row of 500, that for sure is a disease. If it's the entire row, maybe we need to look at nutrition. But it's also possible that you didn't see it happening early enough and it's spread. Hopefully that's not the case. Underside of leaves, purplish brown tinge as it gets older. That's classic fungal. Basically, I think most of you would be able to just instinctively say, oh, we have a fungal problem if you saw that. That's pretty advanced, though. Again, there's different, this is even more mature. This is now sporulating, so we're getting sort of a dark gray color. They're about to release spores. That's definitely bad news. Rhizoctinia, this is damping off. Typically, what you see is a choking of the main vasculature at the soil level. And sometimes it's called black root because you get this black stem that progresses up, and eventually it moves up the stem, and then the plant dies. Leaf spot. Oh, by the way, that previous one's mostly looking at young plants, but it is possible to get it in stems of mature plants. But if you're properly sterilizing your water, you should not see that. Leaf spot, bacterial leaf spot. This is an ugly one. Pseudomonas is the bacteria responsible. You can see it on the fruit or on the leaves. Typically, we get sudden wilting. We get hollow stems, brown discoloration. If you crack the stem open, it has a kind of a rotten smell. See, I don't know if you can see in this picture, the stem has gotten dark. So this is up here, some here, like a little bit there, but you can see the spots on the leaves. So this starts in the leaves, progresses into the vasculature, and heads back into the plant. This has to do with water on the leaves and poor hygiene, right? So we don't want water dripping from our greenhouse onto the leaves. We want to try to avoid that. That means managing moisture in the greenhouse to prevent condensation. Some more pictures. Bacterial leaf spot or Pseudomonas is often controlled with copper fungicide sprays, which are non-toxic. The copper spray will suppress it. But again, we want to avoid condensation, not only on the leaves, but on the greenhouse structure itself. Let's talk about some viruses. There are some tomato ones, and then there's some generic ones. So tomato spotted wilt, tomato yellow leaf curl, pepino mosaic virus, cucumber mosaic. The common thread here, which I'm sure you've heard before, is that thrips, aphids, whitefly, piercing, sucking insects are your vectors for those disease. So obviously keeping them under control and in reasonable numbers is your best bet for minimizing the incidence of disease. You go to a place like Leamington or Kingsville where the greenhouses are all within a few hundred meters of each other. It's not hard to spread disease between farms. So a lot of them, I think I mentioned earlier, have bug screens now on their vents, which is fine for controlling disease, but especially challenging for temperature control in the summer, which is why the greenhouses get higher and higher to try to keep that heat away from the crop and give it time to exit through the vents. Those screens restrict the airflow. Viruses spread rapidly through clothing and tools. They last long on organic matter, so they can persist if you have leaves on the ground that are not cleaned up. A lot of farms have different strategies for what they do with leaves that are thinned off the crop as it's growing. Typically, farms throw the leaves on the ground and leave them there until they either rip the crop out or periodically they pull it out. Oftentimes there's a long sheet of plastic underneath the whole row, and they have a machine that they drive out into the center aisle, and it winds up the sheet and in turn pulls all the leaves out and dumps them into a bin. And then you pull the sheet back into the greenhouse. That's certainly it's worth doing. It's just a question of how often you'll do it. So if you are in a house where you know you have disease pressure, you're going to be doing that more frequently. Then, of course, you don't just throw all that organic matter in a pile. You have to burn it or bury it or pay a disposal service to take it away. Really important that you don't have it sitting outside in a pile by your greenhouse. For sure, virus control is maintained by limiting access to your greenhouse, right? That sucks. That, of course, means that people like us can't tour. We know all about that. Looking at work clothing, uh, uniforms, laundry services, hand washing stations. And then interestingly, milk has been shown to have antiviral properties, and that has, well, next slide we'll talk a little bit more about that. But disinfecting hands and tools between crops will help spread reduce the risk of spreading virus between plants. So again, if you're in an area or a house where you have a history of a viral problem in your crops, your staff are going to have strict hygiene policies in effect. And then, of course, weed maintenance around the barriers of the greenhouse. That's really critical. So spraying herbicides or vinegar or salt on the perimeter to suppress the growth of weeds will reduce viral incidence in your crops. As an aside, as far as milk being antiviral, what it is the casein proteins, which represent a lot of the protein in milk, actually bind to the active sites on the virus so that they don't recognize the surface that they're on and won't activate. So it's the casein proteins in milk that do that. This link here on that hot link there goes to an article that discusses the mechanisms. The previous slide was a link to OMAFRA's information on milk treatment for virus suppression in tomatoes. But it's not the whey, no way. It's the casein that does it. Tomato mosaic virus. So this is similar to tobacco. It looks like a magnesium deficiency, but if you see, it's obviously not going to be confined to just older leaves. It could be anywhere in the plant. That might help you. The fruit looks mottled. Mind you, the fruit in tomatoes always looks like this when it has a viral infection, regardless of what type of virus it is, really. Now, if it's bacterial, you get spots, right? But if it's viral, you see these sort of uneven mottling of color. That's a sign you need to do something about that particular vine quickly and remove it in a bag. Follow quarantine procedures, right? So that means encourage tomato social distancing. My wife's laughing at me. But seriously, choosing resistant cultivars, there's plenty out there to choose from. So in your seed catalog, you have to make sure you're ticking all the boxes that you need for your farm. If there's a history of virus in your area, then you want to choose resistant cultivars. There is no perfect tomato variety that has everything in it. Difficult to find. So you make compromises, right? Maybe you're better at controlling certain disease incidents than others, so you're going to give up on that trait to maintain the other possible traits that you really need. Some interesting sources of virus. Tobacco. So typically smokers, so staff that smoke, are vectors for disease because tobacco plants typically have a lot of virus in them. Tobacco farmers are not concerned about what the leaves look like because they're being dried and shredded. The customer never gets to see what the leaves look like. So they're not going to just destroy a crop right off the bat. They're going to harvest it, blend it in with the rest of their stuff, and no one knows the difference. And the crazy thing is that the viruses can withstand a fair amount of chemical and temperature pressure. So I've got a picture of someone smoking fingers there because let's say they go for a smoke break and they come back into the farm and they're working in your crop, you may end up with tobacco or tomato mosaic virus. Just be careful about that. You want to make sure that you put a hand wash station near the smoking area to ensure that virus is not transmitted. The other thing is it's not always foliar. I have roots here because roots are an entry point for these as well. So treating your irrigation water is important. Temperature won't necessarily do it, but strong oxidizers will. So something to keep in mind. Tomato yellow leaf curl virus, pretty simple. The leaves go yellow and they curl, right? It's in the name. You shouldn't have much trouble remembering that. The leaves are often stunted. It's pretty clear something's wrong with that plant. Again, how do you determine if it's nutritional or viral? You're going to look for is the plant alone or in a small grouping, or is the entire row affected? If the whole row is affected, likely nutrient. If it's a few plants, likely viral. The most common vector for this virus is the whitefly, which of course is one of the more common pests in tomatoes in general. So you really want to make sure you're heavy on your Encarsia early in the crop cycle and you never let up. So that means staying on top of your release and keeping the number of Encarsia released proportionate with the size of the crop as it grows. Cucumber mosaic virus. So this has kind of got these random mottled looks. These things they look a lot like a boron deficiency. So same thing applies whether it's nutritional or viral. That's what you want to keep an eye on.